What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. Devil eyes. The plan after 9/11's to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes, and black markings, basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. This isn't really a classified document, but at one point the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family. And it showed how to dig a 8-foot by 4-foot by 10-foot hole in your backyard, and if there is a nuclear threat to get your family and go in there and cover it with a door. So obviously that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later it came out that the purpose of telling families to do that was so if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own grave. So yeah, not classified, but along the same disturbing stuff the US government did. The Nixon administration had a speech prepared for if the moon landing had failed, and it's chilling. You can read it here. Really is chilling. Imagine if they landed on the moon and were unable to lift off again, just having to sit there and stare at Earth as they die. Yikes. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the US Air Force in the 1950s alone. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired sex workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. Here's one from the Brits and the Aussies in the 50s. Nuclear tests in Maralinga. Oh yeah, some Aboriginals lived nearby. The government were going to nuke Scotland for a while, I think, then they realized that was a stupid idea, as Scotland is a pretty small place relatively speaking, and nuked Australia instead. I'm kind of surprised they didn't do as the Americans and nuke a territory in the Pacific. The Pitcairn Islands are still British, and they didn't care about protecting endangered species then. Australia was independent in the 50s. I can't imagine the High Commissioner asking if we could nuke part of Australia. Boeing X-37B unmanned space shuttle. It just spent 720 days in space doing God knows what. Testing stuff. And maybe taking pictures like the one Trump tweeted of the Iranian space launch site. Edit. Apparently the USAF has disclosed that it's testing a heat pipe assembly, but I'm sure there's other stuff we are not allowed to know about. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests, and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same on ecological protesters from organizations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago, an undercover cop, I believe, married and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. Canadian here. The Somalia affair, not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. An out-disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something shitty, it's not always the bad guys who can be freaking evil. We have something similar in Belgium. Belgian soldiers tortured kids in Somalia in 1993. Here's a pic, not really NSFW. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. I was searching for this comment. I used to think these sort of things were just conspiracy theories and was like holy freak when I saw the actual CIA papers. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. $20 million to be precise. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Is anyone else ridiculously disturbed that they named the project Sunshine? What the freak? They tested iodine on retarded children as well. In that time, oftentimes orphans and children who were behind in school ended up at these institutions. The US government also inserted radioactive material into a man after a motorcycle crash and didn't tell him. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions there are the norm. I grew up 2 miles from the Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid watching the Hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually people sued and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements, with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. I remember something about a heart attack gun I read some time ago. Basically a poison gun that once shot is untraceable in the victim's body and leaves no mark on their body. Sorry if it sounds really vague. Just watched it a few hours ago. Summary: a poison dart gun that is almost impossible to feel when it hits you. Upon entering your body, it injects you with a poison that causes you to have a heart attack and disintegrates, leaving behind only a small red dot, causing autopsy to determine that you had a heart attack of natural causes, which makes it a perfect assassination weapon. I don't think it's classified, but Project Thor. Using a satellite bomber to bomb a city. Imagine a missile or a bomb coming from space, and before you know it, your city is destroyed by a falling missile bomb. It was called Rods from God. Basically, it would have used kinetic energy, no explosives. It would have used a series of 2,000 pounds tungsten rods to destroy and vaporize without the radiation of a nuclear bomb. It was only avoided because we signed treaties with the Russians not to weaponize space. Can't remember the source, but apparently there is a alleged order signed by Hitler to his nuclear researchers saying if they have a viable nuclear explosive, start loading into V2s immediately. However, Germans didn't come that close to making a nuclear bomb. They didn't consider it a priority because they calculated that it wouldn't be a decisive weapon to win the war, especially against US, who would already have nuclear bombs in their arsenal. Estimates put the probable year for a German nuke, if the efforts continued, around 1947. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which were would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. If you want to read all about it and other things that the US and governments around the world are up to from the horse's mouth, I highly recommend the blackvault.com, the website of Black Vault. Here's 100-ish pages of what I described above, helpfully FOIA'd and archived thanks to his hard work. Edit for some bright side. Via the same source we get Remote Control of War Dogs, Remotely Controlled Scout Dog, June 1974, wherein we learn that we can just train dogs. They respond to audio and visual cues and can be trained to turn on command at long distances by playing a tone over the radio.